I always think about Portland in contrast to where I live, or somewhere like LA in contrast to where I live, and just how radically different those places are. And just the sustainability of that as just like one thing I was thinking about in terms of our ideological separation, physical separation. Because I know, James, you've researched like the rise and fall of empires and stuff.
Yeah.
And I didn't know if the Balkanization was part of that or not, or just what you guys think about just the sustainability. Because I think whenever you first asked me, what are we going to talk about? I think the thing I sent you is something I said, sustainability and Lord of the Rings, or something like that. We'll get to the Lord of the Rings part later.
I understood that. I don't understand any of this. I don't know what you're talking about.
Are you serious?
No.
No. Okay.
Don't take this quadrant seriously right now.
Okay, fair enough. That's a fair point. But anyways, so what do you guys think about just the physical? Like, do you think that the U.S., like its size, contributes to the way that we can separate along physical lines in a way that is, I guess, long lasting? Like, it's, in other words, it's one thing if we could only do it temporarily. Like, but it seems like we can do this long lasting. We have multiple generations that are radically different and only going to become more and more divergent the longer we go with this complete physical separation of places. And I'll get to like the heuristic I had this, but the way that I think about this is a kid who was, let's say 10 or 12 when was Michael Brown killed? 2013, something like that? 2014. Okay. So let's say a kid who's 10 or 12 in 2014, and one lives in Portland and one lives in like Wyoming or Nebraska or something like that. Rural Nebraska, not like Omaha or Lincoln. And so then that kid is, 12 or 14 when Trump is elected, maybe able to vote in this last election or not, depending. But you have a kid that lives in Portland who's raised by the type of people who would want to remain in Portland, want to remain in Seattle or something like that. And a kid who's raised in a more rural area. And you take those two right now, let's say even just right now, they're like 13 or 14. So they're even younger before. And fast forward 5-7 years and put those two in a room together. And tell me, I know it sounds like a joke or something like that, but seriously think about their ability to even talk along shared understanding of reality. It seems that they would not be able to do that to me. And I think one of the contributing factors is that the physical isolation, because of how big we are, that leads to balkanizing. Like, I think we're already unofficially balkanized. So anyway, there's kind of a lot there, but you guys can jump in on that. Tell me if that seems like whenever I say this seems like a reality we're facing as an issue, our balkanization along physical lines and ideological lines that match the physical lines is one of those things that I'm seeing as a problem. Does that make sense, or do I need to elaborate on that at all?
No, well, to some extent, the balkanization of the U.S. is by design. It's not necessarily that it's a
fair.
It's not really necessarily that it's an accident that that's the case. Like, the U.S. was designed in a way where they wanted free men to own land, to be able to own land and grow and prosper, homestead and as such. So, to an extent, there is a balkanization that kind of just comes with being in America, that we're kind of founded on. Now, that's also why we have our federalist system now. So on one hand, we're allowed to have our own individual identities, but we're supposed to hold the same core, like, binding principles that keep us together. And the real issue is that that's kind of what's coming apart these days.
Yeah, I think I agree with a lot of what James just said. I think back of a time, high school football, something went wrong with the away. We were playing away. Something went wrong with the away locker room. They had to put both teams in the same locker room. That's what I see when I'm thinking of a kid from Portland versus a kid from nowhere, Nebraska, going in the same room together. They're seeing different teams. They're trying to look at each other and figure out, what team are you on? I mean, that's what we see so often. I think that's a rather new occurrence. And I think that comes a little bit hand in hand with the evolution of media and social media that has kind of turned politics into a team game as opposed to how to govern its people. So I think with that relatively short span of evolution in just media, I don't know if we've been able to keep up with it and kind of understand how it can be used, how we can utilize it in a way that actually gives us information rather than, muddies the waters. And we kind of use it for our own purposes. And I think we're using it just as a team game, to me, is what it seems like.
Well, hasn't this always been the case, though? Because I remember I grew up in a very small town in Vermont. I really did not have much of any worldly experience when I went to college. I went to Boston University. And, the one thing that was true about Boston University when I went there is it was full of rich kids from New York City. It was like their backup school, and they all migrated to Boston University when they didn't get into an Ivy League school or whatever. And so, I had nothing in common with so many of the people that I went to school with, and this was in the late 90s, early 2000s. And so I kind of think this has always been like this, but maybe it's, I don't know if it's about politics or if it's just about life experience or what, but, I don't think this is a new phenomenon.
I agree with you, but I think it's starting to grow faster because now you don't have to go to a physical location to meet people of opposing views. You just meet them online. right?
Yeah.
So I think you're cultivating that in a different way that we're seeing relatively quick compared to, when you went.
It's
Right.
a bit accelerated.
Well, and it's not just that, but there's an important distinction that I would make, is that, well, a couple things. One is, so let's talk about, I want to go there with what you said, Carlin, because that's actually really relevant. This idea that it's always been that way. And James, to your point about how that's kind of by design with the US. And so let's look at some of the differences between that historically to where it is now. So like you said, like this, that's what states are, right? I mean, that is, we are divided by different states, but it's these United States. So there's an assumption of shared values underlying this stuff. And I think one of the things I put in the outline was, we've always had a divide between rural and urban. I remember, that's why, what was it called? Deliverance was such of a movie that could be made, because it was like, this is how different this is. There have been tropes about people that live in these small areas, what's Journey, right? Just a small town girl. And so like we've always understood there is a divide between the rural and the urban. The distinction that I would make is maybe twofold initially, but obviously there's more to it. But I think the two that really matter is that, so think about like dialects. There's always been regional dialects, right? So you can tell if someone is from Chicago or Boston or Louisiana. Like I was on Xbox Live with someone yesterday and I'm like, hey, what's that accent? You sound like from Kentucky or something. And they're like, close, Tennessee. And so I'm like, okay, like I understand that. Or someone who is maybe in the Northwestern United States, or if you're from Kevin's part of the woods, you might say big instead of bag, right? Like we've always had different dialects for the regions. The difference is now is that we have different definitions of words for regions. So it's not just that there is a different like way that you say things or might think about things, but there is a fundamental difference in the understanding of reality. Yes, in the vocabulary that transcends just a phonetic distinction that goes to like a definitional distinction. So like one of the things I put in there was we cannot coexist in a country under the presumed shared governance where we have different understandings of what the word justice means, what the word oppression means, what the word victim means, what the word man or woman means. So we have the differences are becoming deeper along those lines. And the other thing that I would add is that these differences have went from novel to contemptuous. So it's not just that we understand that there's a difference between someone who lives in, let's say, St. Louis versus someone who lives in rural Missouri, like in the Ozarks. It's not just that they understand, like, you ain't from around here, are you? Like, it's not just that. It's that because of where you're from, I understand, like to your point, Kevin, about the teams, that we actually have an antagonistic and openly contemptuous relationship. So you can have places that are distinct from each other if they have some sense of shared values and some sense of common respect for each other. But where I would say the difference has changed and evolved into something that is much more volatile is there is not a shared vocabulary of words that do matter. So Carlin, you said earlier you're drinking a Diet Coke, and that made me think of, so like in Texas, they call every dark soda Coke, right? I think that's fundamentally insane. It's like, what kind of, hey, do you want a Coke? Yeah, what kind of Coke? Do you want a Dr. Pepper or something like that? That doesn't make any sense to me, right? But that's manageable. That's manageable. That is not the same as having a different understanding of what man and woman mean, based on where you are. And so does that make sense? Like, do you guys see that as, yes, we've always had these differences, but these differences have become contemptuous. Like there's actual antagonism and contempt and real contempt and resentment based along these ideological lines that doesn't seem to be sustainable for me. That is different than those divides have historically been.